Well, hello, and welcome to the second of three talks that I'm going to give called An Introduction to Christianity. This one is called How to Read the Bible. And the purpose of the course that we're running is simply to express in simple terms, or as clear as terms as we possibly can, what Christianity is to people who come to it without any prior knowledge or understanding of it. It's a time for absolute basics, but not silly basics, but a real way of understanding where we're coming from. Because we know that Christians have a culture of their own, Christians have a language of their own, Christians have a way of expressing themselves and using words that sometimes may not make a lot of sense to people from outside. So in a sense, I'm trying to explain some of the basic concepts. Last time we looked at who was Jesus, the founder of the faith, and today we look at the Bible, the book that we read. The Bible is the sacred text of Christianity. All religions seem to have a text, a founding, a book of scriptures of some kind or other, perhaps most familiar with the Torah, of the Jewish Torah, familiar with the Quran of Muslims. And the Bible, we call it the Holy Bible, is a book that is revered by Christians and regarded as being definitive. So what is in the Bible is definitive, and Christians will argue about it and discuss it, and there'll be all kinds of different interpretations and understanding of it, but it is universally held as being an authoritative text, and you can't really argue something as being Christian without, in some way or other, being able to relate it back into the Bible. And the Bible, though, is not one book. It's a collection of books. It's a whole series of books. Now, I'll go through those in a minute. It uses and draws upon the books of Jewish history and prophecy. So it is absolutely aligned with the texts of the Jewish faith, but goes beyond them in the second part of the collection, where we have what are called Gospels, 4 books which tell the story of the life of the founder, Jesus, and a series of letters that were sent around the Asia Minor at the time, the very first days of the Christian church, in the first century of the Christian era, where, if you like, the early church were formulating their faith. They're working out what their faith meant and shaping it in a really quite exciting and creative way. As I said, the collection of books falls into 2 parts. Part 1, if you like, is usually referred to as the Old Testament. In more modern days, we give it a different expression, the Hebrew Bible. It's written in Hebrew and really is the story of the Hebrew people up to the point where Jesus was born, and to the point where their temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. And in that you find the history of the Jewish people and their wisdom and their understanding of God. The first 5 books, which the Jews call the Torah, we sometimes call it the Pentateuch, because Penta means 5. So 5 books attributed to Moses, probably not written by Moses, but attributed to Moses. They tell the story of creation, the origins, some very early myths and legends, about how the world came into being. You'll be familiar with them, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Noah, and then the story of the tribes of Israel, how they were formed by the patriarchs and matriarchs of the tribes. And then books which tell the story of the capture of the Hebrew people as slaves in Egypt, and how they believed that they were led out of slavery. They were liberated from slavery by the protection of their God. And that book, Exodus, I mean, the name implies. And then is followed by variations of the same story, but with the laws of the people, the rules and regulations that were worked out in that period of time. And so those books, those 5 books, are really quite definitive for Jews, and they're very important for understanding the rest of the scriptures for Christians as well. Then there's a whole swathe of books which really just are chronicles. They tell the story of the Jews. Joshua telling how he brought the people into Israel after Moses had died. A period of not a very successful period when judges ruled Israel, and then a little interlude, a little story of Ruth, a lovely love story, really, who became an ancestor of great King David. And the next series of stories, books, tell us really of the way in which the Jewish people tried desperately to make kingship work, to elect kings, to anoint kings, to make kings good governors, and the most successful of whom, as I think I mentioned last time, was King David. And it also tells the story of how the people were taken into exile and returned. Quite graphic stories there. I mean, they're quite gripping. And then there's a series of books which are called wisdom literature. They are, I mean, as the name implies, they're kind of folk story, not folk legends, what's the word? They are folk wisdom, folk proverbs, prayers, poetry, nuggets of good ways of living life. And they are, in a sense, a reflection of the ethic of the Jewish people and the beliefs. And then we have the prophets. Prophets were people who not so much directly foretold the future, but they interpreted the signs of the times. They interpreted what was going on, often with very severe warnings, often with very big criticisms of injustices and oppressions within societies. 3 of those prophets are very substantial in their writings: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And they really relate to a period of time when the Jewish people were taken off into exile, and again protected by their God and returned. And then the minor prophets are much shorter books dealing with very specific times, but very much focused on the expectations and hopes of the people, and also the desire for justice and for mercy in human affairs. And then the next swathe of books, the second part, we call it the New Testament, or sometimes it's called the apostolic witness. It's because their testimonies, really, they are what the people who were around Jesus when he lived, and who were creating this new thing called the church after he had died and rose again. These people we call apostles, how they witnessed to Jesus. And the first 4 books are logically the story of the life of Jesus, told from different perspectives: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a rather similar style of writing. They tell the story from either the birth or the beginning of the ministry of Jesus through to his death and resurrection and his teaching and his miracles, as we talked about last time. John is more of a theological, more of an in-depth thinking about who Jesus was from his relationship with God, and it has a rather different style, but nevertheless is a life of Jesus. Acts of the Apostles is the next book, and the Acts of the Apostles tells the story of the early church. It tells of key characters, disciples of Jesus, St. Peter, St. John, St. James, St. Philip, St. Paul, these people who were absolutely formative in the early days of the church. And it tells the story of how they spread the church from its humble beginnings in Jerusalem right through to Rome and beyond. And while that was happening, the founders of the Christian faith, I mean, the original proponents of it and preachers of it, were sending letters to little communities that were growing up around Asia Minor. And so we have a series of all those letters. Very interesting, doing what I'm doing now, which is trying to explain the Christian faith to people who are new to it, and at the same time correcting errors and correcting things that they were going awry. And then so there's a series of letters from Paul and a series of letters from other people, tend to be rather shorter than Paul's letters. And finally, the last book of the Bible is called Revelation or Apocalypse. It's a very hard book to read because in modern times we don't write things there, but it is a very sharp critique of the Roman Empire and very strong critique of the oppression of and the persecution of Christians, and an expression of faith that Jesus will redeem, that Jesus will put things right, that Jesus's reign is the absolute opposite of the character of the empire. Jesus was not an imperialist. That book is really a very anti-imperialist book, and really represents the pinnacle of our faith, that Jesus will make the world into God's kingdom in the end. Is the Bible true? I mean, that's a really interesting question. I think that some people misunderstand the answer to that question. Some people will say, oh, the Bible is absolutely true. Every word is true. Now, manifestly, it isn't. I mean, there are contradictions in it. There are things that contradict itself. It isn't intended to be understood in that absolute sense. What it is a set of legends, stories, oral traditions, poetry, song, theology, wisdom, visions, all of which have been collated and woven together, both internally in each book and across the whole of the spectrum of the books. And so really they are a broad statement of faith in God and in Jesus. They're statements about a faith of a God who acts in history, who created the world, but at the same time remains present in the world, acting and working. So there are different perspectives in the Bible. There are different ways of looking at things. I mentioned the 4 Gospels that tell the story of Jesus. They have different angles, different ways of looking at it. And that's to the enrichment of the Bible, and that makes the Bible such an interesting book to get to know. And in a sense, it is overall, from Genesis to Revelation, it is a myth. And I mean that in the best sense of the word. A myth is an overarching story which points to deeper truth. So the overarching story that God created the world, that God has got a purpose for the world, and God has got a purpose in history, that God's purpose is to liberate people. God's purpose is to save people. God fundamentally loves the world and loves the people in it. but actually loves us so much that he does not take away our freedom, even the freedom not to love God. And that is the myth in the best sense of that word. That's the overarching story. And all of the little stories, the little books, and the legends and the parables and the miracles and all the things that happen there really are just ways of illustrating that central truth. So the truth is a truth about is the truth that we accept as Christians, that God has a way with the world that is and a purpose for the world, a mission for the world, which is fundamentally good and fundamentally loving, and that I believe is true, even if I'm not sure whether every single sentence of the Bible is factually correct. And there are big themes in the Bible, in that overlap. One of them is really important. It's the word covenant. Now, the word testament is the same as the word covenant. I mean, it's just an old English word for what we understand and call covenant. So the New Testament is the new covenant. The Old Testament is the old covenant. And the story of the Bible tells us, particularly in the early parts, of God forming a covenant with the people of Israel. A covenant with Moses, a covenant with Abraham, a covenant with Noah. And that covenant is an agreement. It's an old-fashioned word from the ancient world where a treaty between two nations or two tribes would be called a covenant. And so God makes a covenant. God makes a treaty with humanity. Extraordinary idea, really. And that the consistently humanity fails, and so that when Jesus comes in, the prophets in the old covenant, the prophets were constantly telling the people, we need a new covenant because you're not obeying the existing one, and that's why Jesus comes and calls himself the new covenant. Second is the idea of exodus and exile. The Jews, as I've said, were slaves in Egypt, and they were in exile in Assyria and exile in Babylon. They were refugees. And that experience really, really colored their understanding of God. They see their God as a protector, their God as a liberator. And that is reflected all the way through into the New Testament as well, that Jesus was seen as a new Moses. You know, Jesus was seen as bringing the people back home while the Romans were occupying their country. The notion of kingship as well is a similar kind of theme, that the Israelites were constantly trying to get kingship right and constantly failing, that kings were letting them down right, left, and center. So when Jesus is crucified and called the King of the Jews, and Jesus is seen as being the initiator of the kingdom of God, it's a way of saying, no, we've given up on expectation that there will be a human leader who will put everything right and be the savior. That sort of notion was out of the window. Jesus was saying, no, in my suffering, I will show you what power is. In my suffering, I will show you what kingship is. Remember, he wore a crown of thorns at his crucifixion. And that view of kingship, that alternative view of power, is really very important. And then salvation. I mean, salvation simply means cleansing, healing. There is the possibility of healing in difficult situations, whether that be in terms of our physical health, whether that be in terms of our, and this is perhaps more important, in terms of our interpersonal relationships and our communal relationships and relationships between nations and tribes, and that forgiveness and reconciliation are, absolutely fundamental stories. Where to start reading the Bible? I mean, I think it's a difficult book to begin. I mean, you don't read the Bible from chapter 1 right through to the end of the book of Revelation. You don't read it from cover to cover, although maybe, over a period of time you will have read the whole book. But I would suggest that you start with some things that are digestible. I've suggested some books there. Genesis is a great book to read. It's a book of legends and stories and history. Exodus is also a book of really importance and tells a good story. So that's good to read from the Old Testament. And in terms of prophets, I mean, there's some very short books by Amos, Hosea, Micah, but they really focus in on social justice and are very relevant books for today, and give you a taste of what the prophets were about. And then if you want to read one of the Gospels, I mean, Mark is a great one to read. It was the first one that was written. It's the shortest, and it's very, very punchy. You know, it moves very, very quickly. And Luke is a lovely book. I mean, Luke's way of telling stories is lovely. Luke is believed was a doctor, and he wrote the Acts of the Apostles as well. And that's a really good way of starting to get an idea of how the church is and how it was in its early days. But, you know, they're just beginning. They're just ways of starting. Which version would you read? Now, there are various translations of the Bible. I mean, it's not easy to translate ancient literature because it does take quite a bit of scholarship. I mean, I don't have that knowledge. So an accurate translation is helpful, I think, in understanding, and a translation where the English is nice and clear. King James Version, which is a very famous one, and I often find myself quoting the Bible. If I just do it from memory, it's the words from the King James Version that come to mind. It's fantastic literature. It's amazing literature. It's very beautiful language and has got a real religious resonance to it that people really love. So I don't decry King James Version at all. It's not as accurate a translation because a lot of scholarship has taken place since it was written in the 17th century. I mean, translated in the 17th century. So in terms of modern understanding, it's not so easy. But in terms of literature, it's lovely. I use the New Revised Standard Version. It's accurate, it's clear. Its language is very, very, very good English, and it's based on very good scholarship. It's the one that was recommended to when I was at theological college, and I've used it ever since. Other people like the New International Version, and there are others. And you can test them out, really. If you go online, a couple of websites, the Oramus Bible browser, you can just punch in any chapter, any book that you want, and you can get that in one of the versions that it has. Or the Bible Gateway has got a lot more versions, and sometimes you can compare notes. But there are different ways of reading, and the one I would recommend here is for personal reflection and prayer. You can read the Bible for intellectual interest, and we do, but we also read it for prayerful insight, for deepening understanding of ourselves and our lives and our society. I'll come back to this in a minute. If you are going to study and you haven't done this before, it's a good idea to study with others. And at Union Chapel, we hold regular Bible studies on Zoom, and you'd be very welcome to join. Just email me, church@unionchapel.org.uk, church@unionchapel.org.uk, and you can join the group there. This website, if this works, yes. This website is called Sacred Space, and it's a really good website to look at. I mean, this is today, the 1st of July, when I'm recording this, and you can use this every day. It has a little prayer for you to start with, just to focus and help you just get yourself in the sense of being present with God. A little, what they call freedom, when you make yourself available for a fresh understanding, and you become aware of your own feelings, what you're thinking, what's important to you before you read the scripture. And then there's a little passage from the Bible which you can read. And then it asks you to have a little conversation with yourself and with Jesus about what that passage was helping you understand. And then a little conclusion. So I would seriously recommend that as a way of reading the Bible. Sacred Space website, but there are others, and if you want any help or in understanding those, please let me know. So that was the second of our course. The third one is yet to come online, but I hope it won't be so long. And that third one is what we do in church. When you stand up, when you sit down, those silly questions. Why do we share bread and wine? Why do we sing hymns? Why do we read the Bible in church? All those kind of basic questions we'll look at next time. But I hope you found this one helpful. Thank you very much.